Well, hello, everyone. I am Cécile Shea, non-resident senior fellow in security and diplomacy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Today, I am very non-resident. I am in West Texas, the city of Colorado City, on my way back to Chicago after spending the winter taking care of some family matters in Southern California. And it is very windy here. Just to warn you, they're expecting gusts of 50 miles per hour in the next hour. So if you lose me, that's why. You won't really lose me, but we may lose the connection. It is my very deep honor today to welcome the Honorable Elissa Slotkin, representing Michigan's 8th Congressional District and now running to represent Michigan's 7th consular, that's my old career, 7th Congressional District. Michigan lost a seat. So both districts center around Lansing, but of course encompass a lot of other areas also. So we are so honored and happy to have you here today, Congresswoman Slotkin. As a reminder, the opinions presented today by the Congresswoman and myself are our own. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs is nonpartisan, independent, and nonprofit. We especially want to thank our members for their participation today. Once the Congresswoman and I finish about 25 minutes or so of conversation on some of the issues of the day, we are going to open up the floor to questions, but the only way to ask a question is logging in to ccga.live, ccga.live, and you can type in a question and you can upvote questions that are already there, and I will be passing them to the Congresswoman. So with that housekeeping out of the way, as I say, welcome, Congresswoman. We're happy that you took the time out of your busy day today to meet with us. And I think we'll just, get right to it and talk about all the thing that is, I think, on most of our minds, which is the situation in Ukraine, the horror that we are seeing with some of the reports of what are almost assuredly war crimes being committed there. This behavior is not surprising to someone like yourself who has followed Vladimir Putin and Russia for many years, but it's still heartbreaking. So I have a two-part question. One is the U.S., and you are on the House Armed Services Committee, is the U.S. doing enough to both, on the one hand, help Ukraine to defend its borders, and on the other, to try to encourage some sort of peaceful settlement if that one is possible? And for the long term, what are we going to do about Vladimir Putin?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for having me on. Happy to come and talk to this group about a lot of things that are going on overseas and in international security. So on Ukraine, I think after trying in earnest to prevent the invasion of Ukraine by, frankly, doing something pretty unusual for the administration, the Biden administration was really declassifying sensitive intelligence on an extremely quick turn basis to try and expose what we knew Putin was doing, and by exposing him, deter him from getting in on an invasion. After trying and not succeeding in that, I think Putin has really surprised even the Ukrainians on the depth of his mercilessness, basically, in Ukraine, and with the grandiosity of his ambitions. I think a lot of people thought, well, maybe he'll just come in for Eastern Ukraine or a small part of Ukraine, and he really went whole hog into trying to occupy sort of the center of the country. In terms of what we're doing, I mean, look, I think us in Congress feel like our role is to put pressure on the administration on a bipartisan basis. I mean, it's the most bipartisan thing I've seen in my 3.5 years in Congress. So put pressure on the administration to do more. And if we're not going to get in, as the president was very clear, American men and women were not going to fight in this war and go to war with Putin as two nuclear powers, then we need to turn up the pain on Mr. Putin so that he decides that there's better things to do with his time and gets to the negotiating table in earnest and gets out of there. So in the categories of military aid, economic sanctions, and humanitarian aid, I still think there's more, frankly, that we can do. On military aid, obviously, it's an issue of both quantity and quality. We need to help even the odds, particularly with anti-tank, anti-ship, and anti-aircraft weapons. We're getting a lot to them. We could do more. And while some of it is just getting more in stock, making decisions on anti-ship weapons, for instance, harpoons, is what we were pushing, frankly, the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs today. So more allowing NATO countries to give Russian-made equipment to the Ukrainians, including MiGs, including planes, I'm a big supporter of, like giving them anything that they can get their hands on and can use to defend themselves. On economic sanctions, I think we could have a steadier drumbeat of economic sanctions. We announced more, but we could kind of have a weekly list of these things, particularly just increasing the pain threshold on these oligarchs and people right around Putin, their wives, their mistresses. I mean, you'd be amazed what actually impacts the decision-making in some of those classes right around Putin. And then humanitarian assistance. We've given a lot of money now in Congress. We've appropriated a lot of money. A lot of humanitarian assistance is going out. But we know that this is going to be a long slog, right? This isn't going to be a couple more weeks and we're done. And obviously, Ukraine is devastated. So making sure we keep up a steady stream of humanitarian support, I think, is something we'll be looking for in Congress. So we're doing quite a bit. We could do more. And I see it as my role to push.
So in retrospect, should we have done more 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago? You know, when people would say things back then, they would say, well, there's nothing we can do. But it turns out there are things we can do, right? We're even non-military things that we're doing now for sanctions. So, you know, for future edification with other countries, did we let too much slide in retrospect with Putin's behavior and the Russian army's behavior?
Look, I mean, historians are gonna write lots and lots of pages on this. But the truth is, after the Cold War ended, I mean, I think you can understand it, right? Both Democratic and Republican administrations were happy to sort of take that threat off the table, right? After generations of Americans grew up as Cold War kids, you know, doing the air raid practice under their desks and all that kind of stuff. I think there was truly a feeling like there was a Cold War dividend to be reaped. And I remember coming into the CIA, I'm what's called a 9/11 baby, right? I came in right after 9/11. That's what got me into national security issues. And all of my managers were all Cold War folks. And they were like, you don't know how good you have it. We haven't hired new people in years. We've been contracting. And now, you know, you think you can just come in here. I mean, it was a real, you could see that from basically like 91, we felt like it was just a diminishing threat. The Russians were a diminishing threat. And so I do think that meant that a lot of presidents and secretaries of defense and state did kind of say, well, look what the Russians did here. It's not good. We don't like it. But like, we're not going to, you know, turn it into something that potentially is escalatory. So the 2008 takeover of parts of Georgia, the country of Georgia, like, not good. We didn't like it. We condemned it. Well, then when they came into Ukraine in 2014, that's not a surprising thing after what happened with Georgia. So, and then now when they were able to take Crimea, they were able to, instigate in Eastern Ukraine. So it's not shocking that they felt like they could come back into Ukraine and claim more territory. I'm just a big believer that good fences make good neighbors. And that in particular, with the Russians, like they will test and poke until they hit steel. And so I do feel like, again, listen, anyone can Monday morning quarterback, but for the past 30 years, we haven't been as rigid on those fences, on those boundaries as we were during the Cold War. And I think we gave Putin this idea that he could get away with things. I think he's been surprised at how we've mustered the international community, particularly on sanctions. I think he's real surprised with private companies that have decided to stop working in Russia on their own. McDonald's, Visa, PayPal, like stuff that Russians use and rely on. So I do think he's been surprised by the spirit that has met but the Ukrainians. But I think history might tell a story that we sort of let him get an inch here and an inch there, and then he thought he could take a mile.
Mm-hmm. So many. Let me see here. I hope that you're still able to hear me here. I'm getting a funny message. I want to talk about the southern border, and maybe we can do that after my next question, because you just led into it really well. You have a tremendous resume. As you said, you were an analyst in the CIA. You did 3 tours in Iraq. You met your husband there, so I guess that's the good thing that came out of it. He's now a retired Army colonel. You were in the National Security Council for George W. Bush. You held offices in several executive branch offices in the Obama administration, and at the end, you were the acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security. Oh, ISA.
Affairs.
I forgot already.
Affairs.
Affairs. That's right. I learned how to just speak in acronyms in all my years there. So, you are a person who brings enormous substance and experience to office, and it's so frustrating. I know I hear this all the time from voters and Americans, to see almost a dearth of expertise, to see people who have expertise either hiding it or choosing not to go into public service because they just think that they won't be appreciated, or that people will actually hold their expertise or their capacity against them. We should also say you're fluent in Arabic and Swahili, and I'm sure there's a story there somewhere also. But what are we going to do to get more people who are competent and have strong backgrounds in public service to run for office in this country?
Yeah, well, it is kind of a weird leap. I mean, there are some of us now who were, former CIA and former military, former civil service in the federal government, who then largely in 2018 kind of felt motivated to get into the race and ran. And I think, I think representation matters, right? The number of young people I've talked to who are in public service now, and they're like, I might want to run one day. Can I talk to you about what it was like to make that transition? I think there's more there than you think. But I think a couple of things. Number one, we need to keep reinforcing that public service is deep patriotism to your country. And that's the sort of greatest love letter you can send your country, is to give your time and your sweat and your energy to making your country better. So I think we need a little bit of a kind of revalidating on that point. And then on having people run for office, I think seeing people go from public service to elected service sets a good example, hopefully. But then also asking people, right? I mean, that's the thing I learned when I started running for office, is they were like, a woman has to be asked 7 times to run for office before she seriously considers it. I don't know who got that stat. And that men they don't need to be asked, right? They sort of think about it on their own. I don't know about men or women, but just asking someone who's like really a great public servant and saying, we need more people in office. Have you ever thought about running? I would love to, get involved if you ever ran for something. It just opens up that option as something for people to think about. I think that's the best thing we can do to help that transition.
And we should say, you don't have to be a former civil servant or analyst or foreign service officer to be a good politician, right? But you do have to be someone who values expertise and wants to do a good job and understand what's going on in the world. And we need more of those folks. I try to encourage folks all the time to seek elected office, even though I know it's become a kind of a painful thing to do in too many cases sometimes. Well, thank you for that answer. You are on some really important committees, the House Armed Services Committee, as we mentioned earlier. You're also on Homeland Security. And I've been driving along the southern border for the last few days, not for the first time. I do it pretty often, actually. Can you tell us a little bit about your take on what is going on along the southern border in terms of the large number of asylees and other potential migrants on the other side of the border trying to get into this country? Do you have any qualms about what we're doing about border security, and how are we going to move forward on these issues?
Yeah, there's just very few issues that are as politicized as the border. And I think, frankly, all sides are guilty of politicizing what, could and should and does go on at our border. Yeah. So I think the easiest thing to understand about the southern border is that our immigration system is broken.
Yes.
People are walking from their country, right? Thousands of miles sometimes, risking life and limb, selling everything they have in order to pay some really unsavory folks to get them to the border and over. And they're doing that because at the same moment that we are desperate for people to work in so many of our jobs across the country. Mm-hmm. That means the system is broken and it's not working for anybody, right? It's not working for the employers in the United States who are looking for vetted legal labor to hire. And in Michigan, the farmers, the tourism industry, right? I mean, just unbelievable how many folks are looking for folks to hire right now. It's not working for the immigrants who are risking life and limb and selling everything they have to come and make this journey, dangerous journey. It is certainly not working for Customs and border protection. I mean, all the folks who work on that southern border, borders that are meant to cover max 3,500 people a day coming through are now routinely, being going to be asked to do 8,000 people, up to 18,000 people. I mean, that's overwhelming what that community is trying to do. And then it's not working for the people who are legitimately fearing death and persecution at home and are seeking asylum in a country that, because of our history and our morals, allows people to come here when they are fearing death and persecution. So it's broken, and both parties bear responsibility for that. We do not have an immigration system that works for anyone. So that you have to have a system that incentivizes coming here to work legally, where you can apply and get in from your home country. Mm-hmm. For those economic migrants. And then, of course, always remaining a place where if you're truly in at real danger, right, that you could come here. So I literally had breakfast this morning with the Secretary of Homeland Security, Ali Mayorkas, and we were talking about this very thing. Right now, we don't have nearly as many people coming over the border as we usually would at this time because we have COVID restrictions on. Mm-hmm. The minute those are lifted in May, it's going to be, again, a series of overwhelmed border crossings. Mm-hmm. And I can't support that, right? I can't support ripping off a Band-Aid and not having a plan to stem the blood flow, right? So in any case, it's a shame on the U.S. Congress. It's a shame. It was a shame on the prior administration and the current administration that we don't rally to do something, particularly since our economy could really use an infusion of legal workers.
Mm-hmm. And, there comes a point, too, where it's almost anti-capitalistic to have large numbers of undocumented people who will work for lower wages than a citizen, or even the huge number of guest workers, 3 to 4% of our labor force prior to COVID, who are in some cases almost indentured servants. And how is that fair to citizens who want to, or to anyone who wants to be able to cross the street and get a higher wage? So yes, there's so much room for reform in our immigration system. So thank you for saying that.
And I would just say, just because you mentioned the Homeland Security Committee, every country in the world has the right to know who's coming in our borders.
Absolutely.
Right? Illegally coming and crossing a river and coming into the United States. We have every right to know whether someone is a danger to us, whether someone is a public health risk to us. Like, we have every right to know that. But it gets, everything about the southern border gets politicized. So I sponsored a bill that's trying to provide a different way at securing and looking and getting intelligence on what's going on at the border. It's not a wall that's going to keep us safe. It's understanding and having like a full intelligence picture of what's going on with these criminals who are bringing people over, the whole thing. So I think it needs some really different thinking and some open-mindedness to come up with a solution that works.
Can you tell us a little more about kind of how you picture that? Because there are already a whole boatload of cameras everywhere along the border, and there are checkpoints, and they stick their head in and look inside your motorhome if you're in a motorhome. What is that? What you're talking about? More of that, or are you talking about something else?
No. So you're right that we have good coverage at the border crossings, right? It is often these huge spans of territory in between border crossings, where I think there are different ways, like through new technology, to in a very discreet way collect more imagery, more understanding of what's happening at the border if there is someone using and exposing a weakness and coming through. Making sure we understand where our gaps are. The Customs and Border Protection folks will tell you there's big gaps in what we can see and what we know is going on. And then it also is frankly, pushing Department of Homeland Security to think beyond a physical wall or just a single camera and moving to just the new technology that helps us understand data in a clear way, but also intelligence collection on these networks of coyotes who are moving people around the border. These are not simple, like a guy just pulls up and he decides he's going to start taking money to move people across the border. These are organized, centralized, crafty, technology-driven people who are, or networks, like lots of other criminal networks around the world. And we need to understand how they get their money, how they do surveillance, how they collect information. So it's a whole bunch of deepening of our situational awareness on the southern border that I'm talking about.
Is there also a source issue? I mean, should we be doing more to, help the countries of Central America deal with some of the drought problems they're having, not to mention the crime problems they're having in their cities that are, no one, as I think you just said, no one voluntarily leaves their home and walks through Mexico or sends their child alone to walk through Mexico and try to get into the United States. They have to be really desperate. So what should we be doing at the source end?
Absolutely. The root cause issue, right? You have to get at the root cause. And I think one of the most confusing things that happened in the last administration was when there was so much focus on the border, but then they canceled all this international aid going to these Central American countries. It's like, if you want them to stay, their economy has to be, functional, and therefore they need some help on that, right? So 100%, and I know the Biden administration has been looking at different ways to incentivize, getting rid of corruption, some of those endemic problems that they have in Central America that are causing the system to not function the way it should. So you're right. You can't do it without addressing that. But in the short term, right? I would much rather have someone apply to come and work at a farm in Michigan from their own capital, at the U.S. Embassy or a commerce office in that country, than make that journey and overwhelm our border folks when they arrive.
And that consular officer in Tegucigalpa or wherever is much more familiar with the human rights situation in Tegucigalpa than, some border patrol agent at a border who is overwhelmed. So, I appreciate that you have said that very much. We have an interesting question from out in the field. We're switching now to ccga.live if you have any questions. What do you think is the most pressing global issue? Good luck with this one. What is the most pressing global issue facing our country and the world today?
I think that, to be honest, kind of the instability. I think we're 5 years in to a decade of instability globally.
Yeah.
And I think it's like a giant mixing bowl, right? Things that we thought were stable and consistent are changing. And you look at it, it's something global because the instability we're having, let's say in our political world here in the United States, is also, we've got instability in places like the UK, obviously Europe. Lots of other places are experiencing this. And I think in that context, as an American, I don't know exactly what the next 10 or 15 years looks like. And I'm a believer in strong American leadership in the world.
Yeah.
Not to say we're perfect, not to say we do everything right, but I would much rather have us as the pace setter than the Chinese government, right?
Absolutely.
The Russian government.
Absolutely.
So I think the instability combined with the rise of or competition among sort of superpowers or up and coming superpowers, particularly the Russians and the Chinese, is probably what I think is the biggest national security issue we face.
Yeah, and I think you're talking. There's also this issue of the tyranny of the urgent, and now we have way more urgent things than we had 6 months ago, even versus long-term issues, including global warming, right? And so, how do you balance the need to get gas and oil to Europe right away with the fact that we're just pumping more methane into the atmosphere?
Right. The best thing that I was ever taught on how to manage dealing with the tactical versus the strategic is when I was at the Pentagon. I had a boss and a mentor who used to say, you have to give the future a seat at the table. You have to literally have folks in the room when you're dealing with those tactical issues, when you're dealing with who are their job is to think 10 years ahead, 15 years ahead, 20 years ahead. So you always have a voice being like, yes, we know we have to deal with this latest crisis, but we also need to be putting ourselves in a position to deal with some of these longer term issues. And it's been a good lesson for me that I take into Congress. Right. I've got to vote on things this week and I need to understand those bills. I also need to be planning 3 months down the road for the cybersecurity bills that I want to introduce then, doing that hard work now to set myself up for those bills 3 months, 6 months, a year down the road.
Mm-hmm. So we have two interesting questions here and we've still got time. So that's good. You live on a farm. One of your ancestors, I believe, developed ballpark franks, is that right?
Yes, the Slotkins are hot dog people. We had a meat company, and we did all the meat for Nathan's hot dogs for the first 50 years.
Really?
And then we invented the ballpark frank at Tiger Stadium in the 50s. So
how about that?
Is true. Yes.
Wow. So how does you're living in DC, you represent Lansing, which is an urban area, but how are we going to bridge this urban-rural divide, not just in our country, to your point, but in almost every developed country right now has this issue that they're dealing with, right? And how has your background of understanding the agricultural community informed both your work in the executive branch for those decades and now informed your work in Congress?
Well, I think it's probably true for most Midwesterners. That if you're anywhere in the Midwest, you're not more than a stone's throw away from the beginning of the exurbs and soon into farmland, right? I mean, my brother lives in St. Louis and we'll drive from Michigan to St. Louis and you go through a couple of urban areas, but it's large expanses of rural communities. So I think just being a Midwesterner helps. But obviously having a family farm, what was a beef cattle farm and is now sort of soybeans and winter wheat, I think it just grounds you in quite literally in the here and now and in the practical in a way that some of my peers in Washington don't always see. Meaning, I feel like in every conversation, I'm just trying to figure out how do we get from point A to point B in the most expedient way possible, in a way that brings people along. Like, what do I need to hold firm on? What do I need to compromise on? How do I get this done? And I only get credit if it's done.
Yeah.
And then I find myself sometimes working with some colleagues who maybe they'll go from point A to somewhere else, and maybe they'll meander on back to point B. And the press conference is good. They're not really feeling urgency about getting that law signed, right? And I think the Midwesterner in me is just that practical, suck it up. You don't get points for saying something. You get points for doing it and making it happen. And I think that certainly comes from being a Midwesterner, from having a very strict father that helped, and then living in a community now, a rural community that's about results, not just kind of window dressing.
Mm-hmm. Holly, Michigan, if I recall the name correctly.
Mm-hmm.
So what advice do you give to policymakers in how to approach the myriad of problems that we are facing right now? And also, if you could sit down and and say, we've got all of these global problems. And you've kind of hinted at that a little bit where you say, always think about the future as well as the right now. But what would you want? What would be your advice to policymakers?
You cut out there for half a second, but you said, what would be my advice to policymakers?
Yeah. You've already said part of it. You said part of it, which was think about the future and not just the emergency at hand.
Yeah.
But are there other things that you wish you could say to whether people in Congress working on these issues, or also in the executive branch working on international affairs issues?
Yeah. So, it's something that I find myself saying to my staff, many of whom are young and newer to the policy world, right? It's very easy in Washington for people to get sucked into this idea that policy issues are sort of theoretical. They're important things to parse through and problems to parse through. But people often forget there are human beings on the other side of this policy. There are human beings who are going to have to deal with whatever policy choice you choose. There's also human beings who literally will want to understand what you're working on, who don't speak Washington policy-ese, right? Yes. So I always tell people, before you come to me with a policy proposal, before you make your decision, have you spoken to a live human being, preferably more than one, yes, who's going to be on the receiving end of this? We have a big bill to help our restaurants this week. We've gotten through COVID. I don't know if they need more money. I don't know if they're doing well because everything is rebounded. So before my team comes to me with a recommendation, they're going to get on the phone with 10 of our major restaurant owners and figure out what the situation is before I decide how I'm going to vote. Yeah. And I think a lot of policymakers just forget to actually talk to human beings who are going to be receiving that. And then when they go to write up their little announcement, it's like in a language that normal people don't speak. Yeah. Sometimes I hand my documents back to my staff and I'm like, read it in the mirror. Yeah. And if you would actually use those words, then fine. Okay. Yeah. But there's no human being in the world who says, I'm going to utilize our best tools to help build resilience in our communities. No, they say, I'm going to use the best resources I have so that we're not so vulnerable in the future. So it's communication and remembering that there are humans at the end of the policy conversation.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think one of our big failings, particularly in the last 15 or 20 years on immigration and on trade, is that we forget that, as policymakers, we talk averages, right? Oh, this is worth 3% to our GDP. This is worth 4%. Well, it's an average. So someone's making 10% and someone is losing. And sometimes you have to acknowledge that there's going to be losers, or at least talk to them, or at least, because they just get angry when you keep telling them how wonderful something is, and for them it might not be so wonderful.
Yeah, that happened to me in December. I was worried about inflation. I found myself at the White House among some cabinet officials, and I pulled them aside. I said, we have got to do something on inflation. And this person said to me, I know inflation is bad, but wages are going up too, right? And it's like, that probably is true for someone somewhere. Yeah. But I don't know one person whose wages have gone up in proportion to inflation, or at least at that point. And so, you're right, the average maybe somewhere in there, but for the human beings that I'm talking to, that is not the case. And unless you see beyond numbers, you sometimes forget that.
We have a question about North Korea. Would you like to answer a question about North Korea?
I can try. I'm not going to say I'm an expert on North Korea, but sure, let's try.
What should we be doing about North Korea's nuclear program?
Yeah. I mean, this is the age-old problem, right? I'm somewhat convinced that Kim Jong-un was everyone was focusing on Russia and he wanted some attention. So he pops off a few, dangerous projectiles. I think this is a tough nut to crack. Lots of administrations, Democrat and Republican, have tried to deal with the North Korea problem. And it just doesn't seem like they are willing to trade for their nuclear program, that they feel like they must have it. And therefore, no matter what we put on the table in a negotiation, whether it be a Biden or a Trump or whatever, they're just not coming ready to trade. And so it's about minimizing the damage they can do. It's about making sure we understand ahead of need what, through intelligence, what they're doing. And then being open to those off ramps and those negotiations if they're willing to have them. But I don't know that we can say with a straight face that in a long time, the North Koreans have truly been willing to really consider giving up their nuclear program.
Yeah.
So it's containment, frankly.
Which is hard to explain to the American people or even some members of Congress, right? Alliance management or containment management is very unsatisfying to people sometimes. But.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think President Trump, I'm not saying I loved the approach, but he definitely tried something different, right? I mean, he's like, I'm going to love this guy to death. And I'm going to try and be, so solicitous to him and so close to him that I'm going to get him to do the things that he's not been willing to do in the past, right? I'm going to try the carrot, not the stick, the good cop, not the bad cop. It still didn't work. Yeah. So, we got to keep trying. That's the role of diplomacy. But I'm a pragmatist, so I'm not sure how much I'm ready to believe that that regime is ever going to willingly give up nukes or the prospect of nukes.
Thank you. We have two great questions, so I'm going to go ahead and ask both of them, and maybe they're not totally related, but they're both about Michigan in a way, okay. And broader than Michigan. But Michigan has had more than its share of kind of frightening problems with domestic terrorism, and what should we as a country be doing about things like white supremacy, domestic terrorism, movements? Almost new religions, and as a member of the Homeland Security Department of the Homeland Security Committee, where do you think we should be going with that? And the second question, which I love, is what do you think your constituents wish the rest of the country knew about your part of Michigan?
Oh, okay. So I would just say on domestic terrorism, and again, you broke up just a little bit, but we certainly have seen our fair share of it in Michigan, and we've seen militia activity certainly kind of up and down in our state. The plot to kidnap and kill my governor obviously is a big headline grabber. I am the chairwoman of the Intelligence and Counterterrorism Subcommittee. And so I think on domestic terrorism, first, we have to establish a shared vocabulary. Sometimes people are talking about very different things when they say domestic terrorism. So we need a common definition. We need to make sure that our law enforcement are doing the intelligence collection required to keep tabs on some of these folks. I think that we got surprised on January 6th by the level of organization and sophistication of some of these groups in terms of organizing and planning for violence. We need to make sure the entire US government is looking at this issue. A lot of it is not just about law enforcement and intelligence, but making sure people have economic opportunity, making sure there's education going on that gets at some of these issues. I think we need to remember that we are a country that believes in the Second Amendment, and that you have the right to express even really heinous views on things. But the minute you cross over into threatening other people, you've lost your right to the Second Amendment. And that's a very important distinction. And making sure that law enforcement is ready to respond when the freedom of speech crosses that line into threats of violence.
Right.
And setting examples of people. That's why this issue of the plot to kidnap and kill my governor, right? Like, I'm glad that is playing out in the newspaper so that people who are thinking of doing a similar thing realize like they're deterred from doing it if they're going to lose their house and lose their family, et cetera. And then we got to work with nonprofit organizations to confront radicalization and, where necessary, help deprogram folks if they are bent on violence.
Yes.
So I think those are the things that we're looking at in our committee. In terms of what I think people in my district would want people outside to know, it's really not that complicated, okay? We want to do well. We want our kids to do better. And we want opportunities that come with just having a life of dignity.
Yes.
And for a lot of us in the Midwest, that's about work. a living wage where you can afford with one job to sustain your family and give your kids the chance to go to Disneyland, to have a little fishing place up north, like something. And we really feel like we invented the middle class in Michigan with our auto jobs. You could be an auto worker and be working on the line in a plant, and you could afford the car that you were building. That was revolutionary, right? Yeah. And we've, got people in our state and in the region of the Midwest who are doing worse than their parents.
That's right.
And there's nothing more demeaning than not being able to give your children what was given to you. So I want people to realize that for us, the future of work is critical, and that we're not looking, for much, but we want what we believe was promised to every American, which was the ability to live out the American dream and work, have a decent job with good benefits, and provide for our kids. And it's not that we don't care about other issues. It's that if you don't have dignity in your own life, it's really hard to care about, every other kind of trendy issue that's out there. Right. So, and by the way, I think 9% of my district's on Twitter. So Twitter is not the real world in my district. And if you want to talk to people and understand where they are, you got to come and see us.
Yes. Well, thank you for coming to see us today, Congresswoman. It's a pleasure. Thank you for your service. Thank you for providing us so many wonderful insights today into the world around us. And I've learned some things about Michigan too. And thank you for stating them so eloquently. We wish you all the best.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.